Decide whether each relation defines y as a function of x, and then give the domain and the range. All right, so let's take a look at this. We have y equals 8 over x minus 8. So again, first thing we want to do is we're going to create a table to see, what values we can pick for x to make sure we can define x or y as a function of x. And again, we know that y is going to equal 8 over x minus 8. Okay, so in this case here, you always want to try to pick numbers that are either negative. You can pick values for 0 for x, and then pick positive values. So in the denominator, you can see that we have x. So I'm going to start with a negative number. And the reason why I'm going to choose this number is because I just want to make sure that the denominator is not going to equal 0. Okay. So if x is equal to negative 8, okay, this is 8 over negative 8 for x minus 8. In this case, we get 8 over negative 16, which is going to give us negative 1/2. Okay, now we tried a negative number. Now let's try and see what happens when we select a 0. Okay, so if I pick a 0, we get 8 over 0 minus 8. And that's going to be 8 over negative 8, which is then going to give us negative 1. Okay, now let's say if we choose positive 8. So if we have 8 over 8 minus 1, 8 minus 8. Let me go ahead and erase that here. So we have 8 over 8 minus 8. That gives us 8 over 0. And so what do we get? We get an undefined result. Okay, so what we notice here is that it's going to be undefined for when the value is 8. Okay, now if you notice that if we pick up any of the values of x other than 8, we're always going to get a value. But again, we want to determine whether this is a function or not. So a function tells us that we have exactly one x value that corresponds to exactly one y value. So we have an 8 that corresponds to negative 1/2. We have a 0 that corresponds to negative 1. We even have the positive 8 that corresponds to undefined. So we're not going to have the same number in the x column in this case. So therefore, this is going to be defined as a function. So we're going to say, yes, this is a function. Okay. Now we want to determine what is the domain of this function. Well, we just looked at the fact that this is the domain. The domain are all the x values. Okay, so what do we know about the domain? Well, again, if we wanted to graph this on the number line, okay, we want to take a look at the number line, and we know that we're going from negative infinity to positive infinity. Okay, and we know that at the value of 8, okay, it is undefined, which means that we cannot include 8. So therefore, we're going to have a parenthesis that's going to go towards negative infinity at 8, and then there's a parenthesis at 8 again, but it's going towards positive infinity. So the domain is going to tell us that we have negative infinity to 8. The parenthesis tells us that we can't include it. Union, and then we're going to start at positive 8 and go towards positive infinity. So let's go ahead and check our result to make sure that that works here. So we have parenthesis negative infinity, comma 8, union, and then parenthesis 8, comma positive infinity. So let's go ahead and check our answer, and there is our result. Now we need to determine what is the range of this function. So in order to figure out what the range of the function is, we need to consider what are all the y values that we can pick to plug into the equation. Okay, that's what we want to find. Well, let's say if we let y equal 1, okay, and we would plug it in the equation. So y would equal 1, which is equal to 8 over x minus 8. Okay, and then we would have to multiply both sides by the LCD, which is x minus 8, and we would distribute it to both terms. Well, x minus 8 times 1 is going to give us x minus 8. And then this x minus 8 divided by that x minus 8 is going to give us 8. Add 8 to both sides, and x is going to equal 16. So we can choose any number, but there is one particular number that we can't pick. And that is if we let y equal 0. And why is that? Well, let's go ahead and put 0 in for y, which is equal to 8 over x minus 8. And again, what are we going to do? We're going to multiply both sides by x minus 8. And then we're going to distribute to both terms. Now, if we take x minus 8 and multiply it by 0, we get 0. And if we take x minus 8 and multiply it by the second term, well, that's going to eliminate that, and we get 0, which is equal to 8, which is a false statement. And the only time it happens is when y is equal to 0. So the only number that we have to exclude in the range is 0. So again, if we wanted to graph this, we have our number line. We know that we're not going to include 0. And very similar to the domain in the way it's graphed, we know that we can include everything from 0 to the left, and we can include everything from 0 to the right, but we cannot include 0. So therefore, this is going to be negative infinity, comma, 0, union 0, comma, infinity. Let's go ahead and put that into our answer here. So we have parenthesis negative infinity, comma, 0 with a parenthesis, and then union parenthesis 0, comma, positive infinity with the parenthesis, and let's check our answer. Okay, now let's just take a look at what this graph would look like on Desmos. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and then put in our graph. So we have y, which is equal to, actually we can just put in the fraction here. So we can put 8 and then divided by, this is x minus 8. Okay, and let me go ahead and put this variable in there to make sure it's this variable. So now take a look at what this graph looks like. Okay, so what's happening here is the following. All right, now at 8, this is 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, you can see that if we draw a line, and I'm going to show you what this looks like on the graph. Okay, so I'm going to copy this. Okay, and then we're going to show the graph here. Okay, so what do you notice here about the domain and the range? Well, okay, I'm going to use the red for the domain. Okay, so what are all the x values that we can include? Well, since we know that this is the x-axis, we can go all the way up to, again, up to 8. So 8 right here, we can't touch that. We can't go past that graph because it tells us it's undefined there, which is undefined at 8. And therefore, that's why we can't include 8. Okay, now if we take a look at the range, right? So what's the range that we can put in? Well, the range tells us the following. We can put in all the y values, okay, up until 0. And it can go up over here. But you can see here that at 0, we can't include 0. So that tells us why we have to use that as our range. And therefore, this is our result.